Okay.
All right, cool. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Creative Mornings, for having me here. I do have some notes because this is a little early for me, so, I will be referencing those from time to time. It's nice to see some people I recognize here. Molly, of course, from Phoenix Coffee. If you've been here before, you probably see her. Again, grateful for the coffee. Thank you, Molly. Today, I'm here to talk about justice, which is, a super uplifting topic for a Friday at 8:30, but here we are. I think it's a little curious to have a white man talk about justice. Then again, we have had the power to basically define what justice means for the duration of Western civilization. So that's actually pretty integral to the story I'm going to tell you today. Like Molly, I'm with Phoenix Coffee, as Thomas said. This wind is... I might get blown away. That's fine. Like Molly with Phoenix Coffee, I'm the coffee buyer for the company. I like to tell people that my job is to fly around the world and look at trees, and when I'm not collecting frequent flyer miles or getting tussled in the back of pickup trucks or bitten by mosquitoes, I, on a good day, get to taste some damn good coffee. The idea is that I will find good coffee, sign a contract for it, and arrange for it to be brought back to the U.S. for companies like Phoenix to roast and sell to y'all. But what does that have to do with justice? Justice is a nuanced thing. We have the dictionary definition, of course, but we also have 1,000 different phrases with different timbres and shades of meaning. So, for example, justice is served, which means roughly that something has been carried out in accordance with consideration of equity or the law. Or, on the flip side, a miscarriage of justice, or do something justice, meaning to render it accurately or in recognition of its influence or spirit, fidelity and representation. Or what about this one? Obstruction of justice, which, with any luck, we'll be hearing more about that soon. But none of those are really concrete things. They're ideals. I propose that justice is difficult to see, to really see. It's almost an unattainable ideal, like liberty or world peace or, for the millennials, retirement. And it carries with it a moral connotation. Morality, another ideal so lofty that for millennia, humans have attributed its nature to the divine. But it's inverse, injustice. I think injustice is easy to recognize. We know it when we see it. When an act is so unfair and so inequitable that we can't help but see it for what it is. Arrest and incarceration rates for drug charges, redlining, gerrymandering, kids in cages. But what if we're so far removed that we can't detect injustice? What if it's morally ambiguous? You know what I'm talking about. From the iPhone that's made thousands of miles away in China to chickens being cooped and slaughtered, invisibly cleaned and packed in vacuum sealed plastic and put on the shelf, cleaned, sanitized, and stripped of all suffering. We have that in coffee too. Let me give you some context. So, I know it's early, but a little phys ed portion here. How many of you, just by a show of hands, know that coffee is not a bean or a legume, but is in fact the seed of a fruit? All right, pretty good. Yeah, it's the seed of a fruit that grows in a drupe tree in subtropical regions of the world between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. But coffee is native to only one place in the world, East Africa. Specifically, Ethiopia. The place where you can go to see Lucy, the ostensible first human, is also the place where coffee came from. So when you think about it, it's the cradle of civilization, people and coffee. Every single coffee tree and every single coffee plantation in the world can be traced back to Ethiopia within just the last few hundred years. So how did it get everywhere? From Colombia to Vietnam and China and Indonesia, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Peru, Kenya, El Salvador, so on. Well, the story goes that one day, in about the year 850, a Sufi goat herder named Khaldi couldn't find his goats. After a few hours of searching, he found them on a rocky hill, eating cherries of a tree he'd never seen before. He described the goats as dancing. So he ate one of the berries himself and felt invigorated. He grabbed a handful of them, ran back to the monastery, and the monk there disapproved, threw them in the fire, and the cherries roasted, and a beautiful aroma emanated from the fire. They took the seeds out, they ground them, and the first cup of coffee was shared. Now that's apocryphal, of course. But we know that the first historical reference to coffee appears in Sufi literature in Yemen from about the 15th century. And it was used to stay awake for religious rituals. So, work is America's religion, so same thing. By the 16th century, coffee spread to the Middle East, Persia, Turkey, and Northern Africa. By 1600, Europe, Indonesia, and the Americas. The Dutch East India Company was the first company to produce and export coffee on a commercial scale. They did this through a popular mechanization at the time. Colonization. They colonized Java and turned its subtropical highlands into coffee plantations, using indigenous people as a source of labor. The first exports to the Netherlands from Indonesia happened in 1711. Because coffee beans are actually the seeds of a tree, if you were to sprout them, you could actually propagate trees around the world. That would undercut their monopoly, and so they would lightly roast them to prevent that from happening. And so for a while, coffee commercial production maintained its hegemony just in Indonesia. But according to popular legend, a Frenchman smuggled a bouquet of flowers from a lover in Holland containing a small sapling of a coffee tree to the New World. He took it to the French territory of Martinique, and by 1788, Martinique, now known as Haiti, produced half the world's coffee. This incredible growth was made possible through one thing: the human efforts of Africans shipped to Haiti to work as slaves in the coffee fields. The conditions that they faced there, overworked, underfed to the brink of starvation, housed in windowless huts, and regularly subjected to beatings, tortures, and killings, were a factor in the Haitian Revolution just a few years later, which decimated the coffee industry there. Meanwhile, coffee consumption grew across Europe and in the New World. Colonization of India by the British led to an increase in tea consumption, but not here, where drinking coffee was an act of patriotism because of that whole tax thing. It's with Haiti out of play, this increased the demand for coffee, which of course led to an increase in production in the Dutch plantations in Java, which led to an increase in forced labor, where natives were forced by the Dutch to harvest coffee for very little money. Entire villages died of starvation as a result. Many of those plantations are still in operation in some form today. All the while, you had the Pope fighting over whether coffee was a gift from God or temptation from the devil, that whole morality thing. But by 1727, coffee found its way to Brazil. But production there didn't begin until after independence in 1822. After that, Brazil built virtually its entire economy on coffee, clearing massive tracts of land and rainforest for coffee plantations. As exports grew, by 1850, Brazil was the largest coffee exporter in the world, which it still is today. Like in Indonesia and Haiti, the coffee agroeconomy of Brazil was made possible only through the enslavement of indigenous people and a robust supply of humans brought to Brazil from Africa by Portuguese colonizers. Most slaves in Brazil didn't live longer than 7 years under the conditions of bondage there. By the time Brazil made slavery illegal in 1888, more than 4 million human beings had been brought there for forced labor. Coffee spread to Central America too. In Central America, rather than relying on labor imported from Africa, the Spanish conquerors looked to local sources. Why outsource when you can insource? They forced the Mayans and other indigenous people into a state of semi-slavery. The government would violently evict people from their fertile lands and then force them to work those lands, but for no money. So revolts and rebellions define the relationship between the indigenous people and the occupying governments over the next century, with coffee fields serving as the metaphorical and occasional literal battlefields. And like those plantations in Indonesia and the legacy of slavery, that continues today. If you look at the migration happening on the southern border of the US, where are those migrants coming from? Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, coffee-producing nations. I work as a coffee buyer. I travel to coffee-growing countries interacting with people who grow, pick, process, protect, and export this coffee. I don't spend my time on beaches or in resorts. I sleep in farmhouses or workers' quarters in remote regions of countries that most Americans would never think to go. When I started, I wasn't trained. I got hired cheap because I didn't have any experience, the idea being that I learned on the job. In other words, I got lucky. So maybe it comes as no surprise that by the time I'd been buying coffee for a couple years, it all seemed sort of strange how it tended to work. Call it an outsider's perspective. I remember my first trip to Africa. I'd been a coffee buyer for a couple years at that point. This was my second time out of the country. I still kind of look like the guy in my passport photo back then. Tall, handsome. And I look out in the crowd today and I see a lot of people who kind of look like me. I want to challenge you. How many times have you ever walked out a door and felt out of place? The kind of out of place where everyone in a city of 12 million people might as well be looking at you the second you cross that threshold. The people in Ethiopia, the cradle of life, who had been fighting sectarian wars for generations and still remembered fighting off the invading Italian armies twice in the last 100 years, while their neighbors next door in Kenya toiled, enslaved, and died at the hands of their British occupiers. And here I was, the capitalist, the American, coming to buy a product from them so I could sell it for more money back home. Buy low, sell high. Next door in Kenya, where they threw the yoke of the colonizers off their back just 60 years ago, 56 years ago, I walked into an exporter's office to find that even though all of the coffee farmers were black and brown Kenyans, the people who the government legally allowed to export coffee all looked like me. Is that justice? And what about the 20+% interest rates these farmers must pay to have cash flow between cycles of their harvest? Because they get just one harvest a year. Who do you think owns those banks giving payday loans? Everywhere I go, the resonance of colonialism and oppression rings in the overtones of our Bell of Liberty. And yet, if you ask the MBAs and CFOs, they say it should be there to do just one thing: buy low, sell high. But is that just? Even after a century of revolutions, liberations, and independence, economic imperialism is the norm, not the exception. If you pay attention and read the news, you probably saw that Starbucks and Nestle was recently discovered that they bought coffee from Brazil from a farm that used slave labor in 2019, a century after slavery was made illegal there. The very nature of mechanisms set up for trading coffee at scale are constructed with imperialist architecture. Cost of production, that's not a thing that factors into the price of the C market, which is the base commodity indicator against which coffee contracts are typically established. In general, for most places in the world, it costs $1.40 to $1.60 to produce 1 pound of coffee. Over the past year, the C market spent an average of about $1.03. That's a little lower than $1.40. That means that for every coffee bought using that typical standard as a starting point for price negotiations, the farmer who produced it lost money. And because of the layers and layers between buyer and seller, the length of the value stream, the value or that feedback is hidden in harvest, export, currency exchange, and shipping cycles. The farmer might never know, and you, the consumer, certainly wouldn't know. It's easy for responsibility to get lost when it's hidden in a game of telephone over 6 months and 5,000 miles. It's the perfect crime. And worse, if you are a farmer and catch on to these machinations, the cost to convert your production from commodity to specialty coffee or from coffee to something else might be too high. You're better off literally cutting down your trees to sell for wood. And that's what you find happening in places of the world like Brazil and Colombia this year. If people aren't getting compensated for their labors, and in fact, if you're further indebted for every berry you pick, isn't that just slavery by another name? Maybe with a little fair trade sticker stuck on the side. I don't know. Economic imperialism is just a form of neocolonialism. It's just another form of slavery. So I understood the looks I felt when I walked around down the streets of the coffee lands. But we, the consumer here in America, we don't have to face it. It's been drained of blood, sanitized, put in shrink wrap that you can pay for with your iPhone. It's hard. It's hard to recognize justice. But I've built my career searching for answers to this problem, building new mechanisms and exploiting efficiencies within the supply chain to ensure that the coffee producers I work with are paid a fair price, 2 or 3 or 4 times the price that little fair trade sticker would indicate that y'all are trained to look for. That's a talk for another time, but if you think that fair trade somehow is ensuring that the producer was paid a fair price, that shows the power of marketing. In Colombia, they have a phrase, Malicia indígena. Translated literally, it means indigenous malice. What it really means is that as a Colombian person, you're endowed with an almost hereditary caution about outsiders. They might be coming to take advantage or take your land. But that's something I know. Doing this work requires patience, communication, self-awareness, as much empathy as can be mustered. And it requires us to become students of history, students of humanity. So the next time you go to buy coffee, try to look at it in a different way. Don't just look for the cheapest thing on the shelf. It's not chemicals, it's not soap. It's an agricultural product grown by people all over the world, touched by human hands who get just one shot, one harvest a year, with one tree producing just 1 pound of coffee. That's it. Dignity can't be bought, but it sure as hell can be sold. So make it count. And if we can't create justice, maybe we can create opportunities for it. Traceability, transparency, trust, community. These are requirements and the only ways to maximize the potential for justice. Justice requires the participation of those who hold the power, and we must engage with it. That being done, we must invite others to share in that power and invite them to share with us the risk they face. It's just fair. Thank you.